English? Yeah. Thank you, Flavia. Thank you all. It's having a wonderful week and it was a pleasure to give these lectures for you. And I hope that you guys enjoy the rest of the course. That looks amazing. I truly would like to have this opportunity when I had your age. So this is special. I mean, and it's an honor to participate of that, although the best things are coming, I'm sure. So today we'll move from, we'll finish the community ecology block. As I said right from the beginning, this is a very biased version of community ecology in which I'm focusing essentially in ecological interactions. And after we talk about interspecific competition, we move to antagonisms. And now we've finished the triad by studying interactions among individuals of different species that may generate positive effects to these organisms. So our main focus here will be on mutualism that can be defined as an interaction that increase fitness of the interacting individuals of different species. And the archetype example of mutualistic interaction is the pollination of flowers by bees. But together with mutualisms, other interactions are studied under the same framework. And this is more a result of the group of people that are studying those interactions than actually necessarily some ecological association among these interactions. For example, commensalistic interactions are usually studied together with mutualisms or by the same people. One of the readings I would suggest at the end is actually the work of the person that more know about mutualistic interactions, Judy Brownstein, and she recently published a review on commensalistic interactions. So, and commensalism is the interaction between individuals of different species in which one of the individuals show fitness increase and the other one is not affected by the interaction. And here again, I will emphasize that these concepts are just metaphors. For example, here we have a shark, and this marvel animal was built up by natural selection to be a very efficient predator that swims and dive in a very efficient way, very hydrodynamic. And then now you have a bunch of fish just moving around them, messing with its hydrodynamics, making the animal much more visible to their prey. But we usually characterize these interactions as a commensalistic interaction. Or like my favorite example, there is a Atlantic Forest site known as Intervalis here in São Paulo. And then you are in the station, in the field station, and there is this advertisement telling that the bromeliads that are growing over the trees are not parasites, they do not harm the tree. And just after the sign, there is a branch, a huge branch of the tree that's broken from the tree because of the weight of too many bromeliads. If someone take out my arm out of my body, I will not call this a no effect, isn't it? So these are just metaphors, just boxes, theoretical boxes that you throw interactions. In nature, those interactions will change in sign, in fact, through time and space. There is a lot of randomness associated also with these outcomes. But it provides some insight to group them and study them as if they are fixed. So today we will talk about what people usually call positive interactions. There is a third interaction that is called facilitation. I will define this later, and how those interactions may affect biodiversity. And Well, first I will illustrate the diversity of positive interactions using mutualistic interactions as an example, because they are usually understudied in terms of their ecology, evolution, and maybe or general understanding, like or basic understanding of those interactions are much less pervasive than predation, parasitism, or even competition. Then we see how positive interactions may shape diversity by modifying the effects of competition and antagonisms. So first we start with exponential growth. We add competition as a logical consequence of exponential growth. Then antagonisms shift the results of competition. And now we add a third group of interactions that will play with both competition and antagonisms. Then we will combine the effects of interactions, that are essentially effects of selection, with dispersal to explain one of the most interesting patterns in community ecology, the ecological succession. We then move to the fact that these interactions create networks locally, similar to the food webs we saw yesterday, but here we call mutualistic networks. And these mutualistic networks may have implications to co-extinction cascades in ecological communities. And I will finish this talk make the point pointing out that mutualisms actually define what we call biodiversity. There is no biodiversity without mutualistic interactions. They are the key interactions defining everything that we classically call biodiversity. But I need to be honest with you guys. I am completely in love with mutualisms. That's what pays my paycheck, give the beans and rice for my kids. So in the past, I tried to make this more scientific, talk about that in a more, maybe a more correct way, to be honest. But I gave up. It's impossible to me to talk about mutualistic interactions without passion. So I will be I'm overemphasizing the role of mutualisms. I'm being honest with you, but please forgive me, it's just someone completely in love. So I would like to, at the end, that we understand at least the first principles about how mutualistic interactions may reshape the effects of competition and antagonism. We'll see how these interactions can actually structure diversity, preventing co-extinction cascades or promoting co-extinction cascades. And then I will argue these very same interactions define what we call diversity. So let's first walk through some small samples of the diversity of interactions that we call mutualisms. And here we are in the world of selection. So we are focused on how those interactions deterministically define the species composition in a given site. And again, we are not talking about evolution right now because we are assuming that we are operating in very short time scales that we can ignore evolutionary processes, although there is compelling evidence that this is not true. But that's okay, it's just a simplifying assumption to make some progress. So I will walk through this axis, what we call interaction intimacy, and the symbols here are individuals, and we are coming to a gradient that illustrates how stronger the interactions among the individuals of different species. So I will start here, in which the two individuals do not interact physically with each other, but they still have creating positive effects on fitness. This is the work that was by Fritz Müller. It was a German-born naturalist and anarchist, actually, that lived in Brazil, go away from Brazil, and living in South Brazil. And he was writing letters to Charles Darwin and other scientists. And Darwin used to call him the king of the naturalists. And he was able to describe this pattern. He used butterflies. It's an amazing study of taxonomy of butterflies and morphology of butterflies, in which they found there is these two different species. Although they are very similar in their color patterns, they are not related, closely related, although those two are not so distant related as well. But here you have another example. Here another example. Here are velvet ants, what we call in Portuguese formigas feiticeiras, is a kind of wasps and bees. And the thing is that both species here are unpalatable to their predators, the potential predators. A bird eat on them, he have a terrible experience, like he vomit, to have a pain. It's toxic enough to make a lot of reactions in the organism. And then, well, birds are not known to be very smart, but after many tries, they will avoid this sign. In some situations, like with coral snakes, they actually they do not learn the pattern. They when they are born, they intuitively are afraid of the color pattern of coral snakes. It's something that was shaped by natural selection. Here is about learning, and this is a mutualism because you increase the fitness of your fitness is increased just by the presence of individuals of the other species, because everybody dilutes the risk of being killed by the learning process of the predator. So it's a benefit on survival. A quick note, the very first model in mathematical model in evolutionary biology is a footnote of the paper by Fritz Miller. In 1879, if I remember correctly, he just wrote in the footnote a short mathematical model explaining how to have two species that share the same sign will increase the fitness of both species. As far as I know, this is the first evolutionary model, mathematical model. But those are, sorry, sometimes get very high. But these are interactions in the sense that you increase fitness, but are not physically interacting with each other. Now we move to interactions in which the individuals spend short periods of time interacting with each other. And in these interactions, the classical example are pollination by insects. Pollination of plants by insects. The plants, they gain, bless you, the plant, they gain, the animal gets resources, food, sometimes substances they use in reproduction, like that they use as pheromones, and the plants get sexual reproduction. Okay, they interchange pollen. Another example is the seed dispersal by animals, especially vertebrates and primarily birds, in which the animals get food and the plants have their seeds take away from it. And this is very important because below the mother plant, the parental plant, the survival rate is very low. So the seed needs to be far away usually to have any chance of survival. And this is my favorite interaction. I started in the undergrad studies studying seed dispersal and become even more my favorite interaction because it turns out that my kids are completely crazy about toucans. And toucans are those magnificent frugivores. And here we are there playing with Toco and Araçari, a toucanet, here in São Paulo State. There are mutualistic interactions in the ocean. So if you go to Fernando de Noronha, an archipelago here in Brazil, and dive there, you see a diversity of organisms that are involved in cleaning interactions, like cleaner gobies and shrimp that remove parasites, damage tissues, mucus, and other structures from a fish, and get resources, food in interchange. But then the interactions start to become very sustained. Until now, the interactions involve usually a few seconds or minutes. Each individual will interact with multiple other individuals through its life. But now, the interactions start to become sustained through time. And this is one of the most amazing examples. There are a huge diversity of plants in tropical forests that not only provide food for the ants, but actually are the ant colony, in the sense that the ant queen comes to the plants, and then there is a nest here, and essentially the plant and the ant's nest is the same. We call that ant plants or myrmecophytes. I'm talking about interactions at the level of individuals, okay? At some point, these sustained interactions become even deeper rooted to each other, and then something happens. One of the individuals becomes much larger than the other one. Or these interactions occur only with this huge asymmetry in size. And now we can call one of them host. Maybe you could call the plant a host plant before, but now is huge, the difference. But then the organisms are just distributed in the external tissues of the host, including the digestive tract, okay? Because this will be, in biology, we classify the digestive tract as some sort of external tissue. And here is one example. We usually think on wild beasts, cattle, and herbivores as animals that feed on plants, but that's wrong. They are not feeding on plants. This animal is like a brewery, actually. You have a lot of microorganisms here. He's putting plants then inside. Then these microorganisms are doing all the work. They are breaking up the celluloses. That is something that animals cannot do. Microorganisms have a much more diverse set of biochemical pathways that are simply not available to animals. But animals can use them in a cooperative interaction, and these organisms break up the plant tissues, and then the wild beast and the cattle will use them and absorb them. Also, the cattle will absorb the microorganisms as well. They just move everything to the next set of its stomach and burn everything there. Okay? In the intestine, sorry, and burn everything there. But for the microorganisms, they are reproducing there. They will die eventually, but they will produce offspring. Remember that a positive interaction here is in terms of fitness. Doesn't matter if at the end of the day you die because of this interaction. What matters if your fitness is higher than in the absence of interaction. And your fitness can be higher because it increases your fecundity or even your survival, no matter if in the end of the day you end up dying because of that. Another example is some ant-plant interactions. At some point, the ants start to take out the flowers. So it's actually castrating the plant, making your fecundity zero. But through a huge period of time, the ants was just protecting the plants, and the plants are able to produce seeds. But in some interactions, they just shift, and they start to kill the flowers, take out the flowers, and then the tree starts to grow because it's not investing in reproduction, it's investing in growth, and so the ant colony can increase more. So those are positive interactions, but it's an interchange of services and resources. And there is a lot of conflicts going on. Now we move even more, and now the microorganisms will be within the cells of the host. And like we have many, many different groups of animals in marine ecosystems that establish interactions with what we call zooxanthella, like in the coral reefs, but also some sea slugs do the same. But in coral reefs it's particularly interesting because we usually think on coral as an animal. Zoological point of view, a coral is an animal. I would argue, I hope there is no zoologist here, that is actually an interaction, because a lot of the energy, almost all energy that comes to the coral comes from their symbionts, the organisms that are living within them, that actually are doing photosynthesis. What's not supposed is not something that animals are supposed to do. And they are not doing what who is doing is the microorganisms. And finally, sorry.
I don't think I understood what is the other organism in this in the example you just gave?
It's another one. This is a slug.
Yeah, okay.
that have also interactions with zooxanthella. Zooxanthella provide different potential benefits to the organisms they use as hosts, and one of them is doing photosynthesis. I don't know if this particular example, the slug is getting any resource through photosynthesis, although this occurs in other organisms.
It's a photosynthesizing microorganism.
Is one of the benefits. There is other benefits.
And it's inside the tissue of the...
Yeah, inside, exactly. It's
Okay.
inside, mixed within the tissue, exactly.
Okay.
And now we move to another one, to the extreme example. It's so extreme that we forget that one of the organisms is actually an organism. We call them organelles. Like the mitochondria, every cell of you is a mutualistic interaction. You guys have two different types of DNAs with different macroevolutionary stories that comes from different groups, and you can actually make the phylogeny of mitochondria, and there is free living organisms that are close related to your mitochondria, then the mitochondria are related to you, okay? But I mean, you include both DNAs, but I don't know why we usually think in our DNA as the nuclear DNA, but we have two DNAs. Just a moment to make your question, because plants are even worse in this aspect, because any green cell of a plant has 3 different types of DNAs. We have the mitochondria, we have the nuclear DNA, and then you have the chloroplasts that are responsible to photosynthesis. So plants are not so different from the corals that I mentioned before. We used to think, okay, plants do photosynthesis. That's true, but they do that because of an ecological interaction, a mutualistic interaction that involves these organelles. This is the work by Lynn Margulis that suggests that the endosymbiotic hypothesis to explain the evolution of these organelles, and the evidence for that is compelling. The evidence that the process of respiration in animals and plants and photosynthesis in plants emerge as a consequence of the fusion of organisms with different lifestyles that leads to a new being through a mutualistic interaction. So the metaphor of the tree of life as a tree that branch out and never merge is just a metaphor. On the very root of the diversification of plants and animals, and also fungi and other groups, we have groups with different evolutionary histories merging together to give the origin of what we call today plants, what we call today animals. You have a question?
Maybe it's a very simple question, but I'm get confused because in that species that have the other individual inside making the photosynthesis and everything, what defines a different species? Because if it's inside it and it's part of the individual, how can I say that it's a different species? If this species reproduce, the new individual will have these other individuals inside too?
So, for some of those organisms, they actually have independent reproduction. So they actually reproduce independently. They just produce the organisms, and the offspring is distributed on nature, okay, on the environment. But in many of those interactions, we start to have what we would call vertical transmission. For example, do you know leaf-cutting ants, what we call saúvas in Portuguese? Those ants, they feed on a fungi, a very specific fungi, okay? It's external, but the fungi can only grow inside the ant nests. The ants do all the protection. You know the story. So when the ant queen will fly away to, a princess will fly away to found a new nest, he take a piece of this fungi and then fly together. So he carry the food. And so the fungi is not reproducing independently anymore. At some point of on these gradients, there is a moment in which the host and the symbiont become not only physically merged, but reproducibly merged, like our mitochondria. Right now, including the reproduction within the cell, the mitochondria, if I'm not getting wrong, I always get confused with chloroplasts, but the genes that are responsible to make the reproduction of mitochondria are on the nuclear DNA. I may remember wrongly, but there is a simplification in the DNA of mitochondria to time because it's just giving functions to the host. So at some point you mix, because those divisions do not exist in nature, it's just a continuum. But I would argue that if the microorganism has the potential to reproduce with some degree of independence, you can call it another name, a different species. But there is another point, isn't it? Like maybe we are just trying to obligate diversity to fit in the box because we are comfortable with the boxes. No matter if you call a mitochondria a different species than you, the fact is there is some pieces of you that are built up independently from an evolutionary point of view, and then are merged to your nuclear DNA at some point, and now they create a different kind of organism. And we are knowing that we now are in this amazing period of time that we are learning that there is a lot of this kind of interaction, not so extreme, but similarly occurring in what we call microbiota. The microbiota is huge. The diversity of DNA that you have in your body is much more than just the two DNAs I mentioned. And some of them are quite integrated to you, and you need that, and you modulate your fitness, your survival, your mood, a lot of aspects of your life. So at some point, maybe we need to think what those boxes really means, if they are useful. But I would argue they are useful for many ecological questions. But maybe for evolutionary point of view, maybe we should see these phylogenetic trees with caution, in the sense that don't get wrong with the notion that, okay, it's a branching process and they never merge again. They do merge again. When they merge, they generate diversity in levels of magnitude higher than we observed in the past. And this will be one of the points of this talk. But, oh, sorry, it's in Portuguese. I forget to translate. Oh, my God. So, are mutualisms important? So if you think evolutionary, well, there is a huge diversity. But if you go to the ecological books, including here the book of the late, oh my God. Of the late Bianca that passed away yesterday. He was an amazing naturalist, zoologist, and ecologist. But if you look the books, the classical books in ecology, and you count the number of pages, and this was Judy Brownstein, the person that knows more about mutualism in the world, did in the past, you say, okay, mutualisms are not important. Just a few pages in each book with just a few exceptions. Maybe Odun's book is the more equitative book in these matters. There is much more pages for competition and for predation and for mutualisms. But this actually, in my opinion, reflects a high historical artifact. Okay, it's just because competition is the logical next step from once you realize that populations can show exponential growth. And predation, herbivory, and parasitism, those are interactions that are really strongly related to our health. Although we now know that mutualisms are fundamental for human lifestyles, isn't it? Like our crops, they rely upon pollination and a myriad of ecological interactions to actually be productive. But we are just learning that. But let's see how the selection imposed by mutualisms can affect the patterns that we observe in diversity in local communities. We are learning that there are key interactions shaping diversity locally. And again, I use this metaphor of the competitive hierarchy here. And the first effect that we see is that the positive interactions may modulate diversity by affecting competitive interactions. For example, mutualisms may reduce diversity. So imagine that you have a very abundant plant species that interact now mutualistically with a given pollinator. This increases the fecundity and the average reproduction of this population, and they take over the region. And we know that many invasive species are associated with mutualistic partners through their invasion. This helps them to colonize new sites. Another example here is there is this grass that's usually very dominant in the paleotropic regions, and in some regions, not all, they make a relationship with a fungi that produce a particular secondary metabolite that is toxic to other grass species. And this will increase the dominance of this already dominant grass locally. Positive interactions may also reduce diversity by reduce the effects of predators in put in check the best competitor. Oops. So in some woodlands in Africa, we have acacia trees as the dominant trees in the physiognomies. And acacias are usually controlled by elephants. Elephants feed on acacia, and sometimes they just get mad and just destroy the acacias, apparently without any reason. Some people argue they are actually build up diversity because in a decade or so they will come back to that vegetation. And you know, elephants are pretty smart, and the matriarchs know what they are doing. So I do not doubt that she knows what she is doing. But the fact is that some acacias, they hire an army. So these are not fruits. These ball-like wood structures are what we call domaceous, in which ants live inside those structures, and those ants are able to protect some acacias of the attack of elephants and giraffes and other mega herbivores. And in this situation, the elephants will not control the populations of acacias. But there are situations in which competitive interactions become mutualistic interactions. And, well, the enemy of my enemy maybe is my friend, isn't it? So here is one example. And this also helps us to illustrate that these boxes that we classify interactions, they are just useful, but they get mixed in nature. It's not that there's a confusion. It's not that everything can happen, but we just need to be careful and use the correct map to a given problem. It's like in a mathematical problem that you have a particular problem to solve, you choose the tools that allow you to solve that problem, right? So the same with concepts. So you grow these two plants together and they compete, and ambrosia is much better competitor than Sheponodium, and then there is a reduction of 90% in the growth of Sheponodium in the presence of ambrosia, okay? Now we do the same experiment, but we add other species. Oops. So this is the negative effect. And now we add other species. So I'm adding other competitive species. What is terrible for Sheponodium, Chenopodium, should be even worse now because you are adding competitors, right? Wrong. The reduction is just 70% in this condition. So what's happening here? What's happening here is that the negative effect of ambrosia on Chenopodium die off because the competitive interactions with other species with ambrosia. Those species are also competing with Chenopodium, but this is much stronger. So now ambrosia are in a worse situation. It's not taking over everything, and as a net outcome, you actually have a reduction in the competitive effect. So in some sense, these competitors become mutualistics of Chenopodium by competing with ambrosia more strongly. Competition and mutualisms are two groups of interactions that may play an important role depending on the environmental conditions. And there is one very important hypothesis in literature, the stress of gradient hypothesis, in which they suggest that if the environmental has very few stressful situations, so it's an environment rich in resources without any particular abiotic factor that make life miserable, then competition is the dominant interaction. But as you move in this stress, in the environmental stress gradient to areas with very stressful situations, so we are moving from the forest to the sand forest without water availability, with strong variation in humidity and with little shadow for the plants. When you move in that direction, then the positive interaction should take over. And indeed, we have some evidence that competition will be particularly strong in in situations in which the stress is low, and when you increase in the stress gradient, you end up with positive interactions taking control. And sorry about that, we can see here. So in some environments, this is very well studied for plants, for some plant communities. And if you go like to alpine communities, when you go up to the top, the conditions are so stressful. There is so much light, there is so extreme variation in abiotic temperatures. The soil is poor. Everything is a mess for plants, so they need each other to actually persist. And then mutualistic interactions are more important. No. No.
Okay, can you just one slide? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I understand like that in a high environmental stress, we need more positive interactions. But this idea of in an environmental that is not stressed, we have a lot of competition. It's not intuitive for me because, like, I imagine that if you have a lot of resources, it won't be any competition. So, can you just explain?
Yeah,
a little bit?
yeah, of course. And this is a very nice. How's your name?
João.
João, this is a very nice question because it's also helped me to clarify one very important point from the first lecture. Is the environment without stress may have a lot of resources at the beginning, but we know that each population can grow exponentially and take over the resource. So the resources are never enough given enough time. The only conditions the resources are not depleted is if there is something or someone preventing the organisms to take over everything. So here, although the environment may have a lot of resources, the main component, and I was not clear before, was the lack of a stress. And this stress can be some physiological aspect of the environment that make it very difficult to get a life on that. Some of them are related to resources, like water availability. So plants are good enough to get water from the soil, but when you're in a stressful environment in terms of water, that is not many water available in the soil, then if a plant requests the help of a fungi are very good in get water from the soil. And then we have a positive interaction going on. So it's not that necessarily has no positive interactions here. It's just that competition can take over. This might be misleading, but competition is very important. That's the relative relevance of both, not the absolute one. So now we're moving situations that mutualistic interactions can also increase diversity. One of them is to allow species to coexist in a stressful environment. But in other situations, it's just a side effect that generates, in this case, would be more commensalistic kind of interaction. So this plant is chemically protected against herbivores, so the herbivores will not feed on that. And this creates some bushes, and other plants grow within the leaves and the twigs of these individuals. And so these bushes are multi-specific. So this is creating a positive effect from one species to the other. It's a commensalistic interaction because there is no benefit from this species to that. So in this situation, by preventing a natural enemy to consume everything, mutualistic interactions increase diversity. Okay, is that okay? And let's go to other examples in which positive interactions can increase diversity. And I will use ecological succession as one of these processes that we observe the role of mutualistic interactions and also competition, like the classical explanation for some of these gradients involve competitive interactions, but other elements are given by mutualistic interactions. So let's use an example. And to do so, let's go to Japan. And there is a nice place to study ecological succession because by some reason, the islands of Japan are constantly destroyed by a number of threats. And we focus on one particular threat. Unfortunately, it's not Godzilla. We focus on volcans. And this is neat. I mean, the Japanese ecologists did a lot of work by trading time per space. So we have a volcan, they destroy everything. But as far as you get from the eye of the volcan, the newer is the soil. Sorry, the older is the soil in terms of cooling down. isn't it? Like around the eye of the volcano is the last part of the land that become available for plants. So if you move in the direction to the volcano, you are moving if you leave the volcano out of the volcano, you are moving through time from early soil to late soil. That's okay? Nah. And so they are able to reconstruct this ecological succession in some temperate forests there in a very efficient way. Just after the soil become bearable, possible for a plant to make a living on that, this species arrives, Aunus. And Aunus, what they once established in the place, it shifts the soil in a different way. And this will allow other species to come over and add other components like nitrogen to the soil, and then this will change again the soil, and then strong competitors will arrive finally and take over the place, leading to that forest that there are and then the ecological succession is over, in the sense that you get like what we call primary forest or climax forest. Like we have now the forest that once, if you keep undisturbed, will keep going similarly indefinitely, okay? So in this process, there is one positive interaction that play a very important role, that is facilitation. And facilitation is a clear example of the utilitarian use of concepts in ecology. Because facilitation, you don't give importance to one of the signs. When I study facilitation, you define facilitation as an interaction that provides a positive effect on one individual, and the effect for the other individual is irrelevant. At least is a first approximation. We don't care. We don't care if this is a mutualistic interaction, if this is a commensalistic interaction, or even if this is actually a plus-minus interaction, because this species will take over. We are just interested in understanding the fact that when some individuals of some species arrive in the community, they shape the community in different ways that allow diversity to arrive, more diversity to arrive, or at least different diversity to arrive. This is very important in some areas of the globe. It's probably important everywhere, but it's very well studied in some extreme environments like the Restingas. This is a sand forest in the coast of Rio de Janeiro. And you see here are patches of Clusia. It's one of the dominant tree bushes there. And Clusia works as a facilitative species because other plants can grow under the shadow of Clusia, and this allows diversity to be maintained in this type of system. And to be honest, this is one of the main effects of facilitation, or at least one of the effects, the most studied effects on facilitation is the effect of shadow. Shadow is very important to plants. Although plants need light, they don't need a lot of light. Sometimes this will kill them. And some plants, by providing shadow, they allow other plants, and this is an example from North America, that this iconic cactus species that everybody saw in movies or in the woodpecker cartoon, they grow under the Parkinsonian shadows. And we call these plants that provide facilitation to the seedlings of other species, we call them nurse plants. And this is fundamental to the ecological succession process, but also there are other mutualistic interactions that are pivotal to ecological succession. In different regions, lichens, lichens are the archetype of the symbiotic interactions. Actually, the first time the word symbiosis was used was to describe a lichen. Okay? And people mock about that. It must be wrong. What are you calling about this? This cannot be two different species merged together, two different individuals of different species merged together as a new being. This is wrong. Turns out that's true. That's what lichens are. And they are fundamental to start the process of ecological succession in some temperate habitats. Also, much of the ecological succession process, just a moment, is related to mutualistic interactions not providing selection on traits, but actually dispersal of individuals. Like on tropical forests, bats are very important in spread seeds and allow forest regeneration. Bats don't do that because they are nice. That's just like, bats just like to fly in open areas, so they just are dispersing the seeds over there. But this is a fundamental process. There is a lot of seeds that arrive during the ecological succession that arrive because of mutualistic interactions with animals, bats specifically, but not only them.
Hi. Hey. About the lichens, I don't know.
I don't know how to say it.
There is a hypothesis that the association between the fungi and the algae is actually a parasitism and not something like a mutualism, because the algae cannot reproduce individually, and the fungi can. So the fungi can disperse and everything, and the algae is dependent on the fungi to do whatever they want, because the nutrients and the everything
is under control, isn't it?
Yes, it's under control.
Yeah, so that's very nice, because you always depend on how you define the ecological interaction, isn't it? And just to clarify, sometimes symbiosis is used as a synonym of mutualisms, but here I'm just calling symbiosis as an interaction that the individuals have an intimate interaction, okay? But in your particular question, the way I take from that is, I think on this problem using two ideas. First, those interactions can move through the outcome spectra a lot through time. And so sometimes, or at least for some species, these interactions can be very parasitic, others may not. But the second one that answers your question is I'm not concerned who is in control. Control might be important, but as an ecologist, I'm only concerned about the numbers, the abundance. And so if the organism gets higher numbers through this interaction, the average individual fitness is higher, so I will not call this a parasitism. I mean, from the natural history point of view, this could be thought as a parasitism because it's taking over the other organism and obligating the organism to do so. But even if you do so, this implies to increase the fitness of the parasitizer organism, then for me it's a mutualistic interaction because the net effect will be positive. If otherwise the fungi remove the potential of reproduction of the lichen, and then the lichen has no offspring, then of course this is a parasite. See, so at least in this purely ecological point of view, control is not something that defines the sign of interaction, it's just the net effect on the partner. I will illustrate later with another example that will be more compelling because it's more close to us.
So, still about the lichens, I'd like to know if there's like any difference between your provocation earlier with the corals and the algae, and is there a difference from the interaction point of view between the fungi and the algae in lichens? Because they both depend on each other, both the coral and the algae and the fungi and the algae. So would it be like kind of the same thing?
Yeah, at some sense, yes.
So why is a coral an organism and a lichen isn't?
For me, a lichen is an organism. It's just an organism built up of two different other organisms that get together and now make a living. The first lichens get a scientific name, but they should have like 4 names, isn't it? Like, because we know the names separately.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there is some part of it is just a historical artifact. Why we name ourselves based on the nuclear DNA. And we thought about that, and then the mitochondria is the organelles. It's just because the mitochondria is very small, there are many there. And the nucleus is a big one doing a lot of things. And I say, okay, so this is us. But us actually include everything there and your microbiota as well. But for me, I had no problem in saying that a lichen and a coral is an organism, but it's not just an animal. Is my point. When it becomes just an animal, it's become bleached, isn't it? Is when they become just an animal. It's just throw away the symbionts. And this, what it is calls to diversity, causes the collapse of diversity. And we'll go there in a moment. Yeah.
Just one fun fact. Lichens are actually 2 types of fungi and an algae, not one.
No, 2 and 1.
Fungi, yeah.
Fantastic. I'm just reading. I'm just now working with fungi. I just start to learn. There is one amazing book about fungi, and it's incredible. I mean, fungi are so diverse, so diverse. This is Untangled Life. Untangled Life. It's amazing. It's truly amazing. If it's not Untangled Life, it will be Detangled Life or something like that. You go to Amazon, Fungi Life, is a wonderful book. So now let's see how mutualistic interactions, when they combine to each other, they can provide ways to increase the persistence of diversity, but also because the very same process that generates and maintain diversity are those that erode diversity if shifted in different ways. The mutualistic interactions can doom diversity in some situations. So let's see how mutualistic networks would support diversity. And to start here, and this is just an introduction on that, there is a lot of different work with that. Here is one of the most famous cases in evolutionary biology of mutualistic interactions. This is an orchid plant that Darwin was studying. Darwin published a book about the reproduction of orchids. And this orchid has a very long tube. The nectar is down here. And Darwin said, okay, this should be pollinated by a moth because it's white, it's not particularly attractive for us visually oriented animals, have the kind of a moth-like flower. So this will be a moth, but to the moth get there and get the nectar, this will be the moth with the longest proboscides recorded in nature. He didn't live to see the moth, but then they discovered the moth in Madagascar, and it is one. So here is a centimeter, so the moth has almost 20 centimeters of length in their proboscis. This is a very long organism. So let's assume that the orchid can only be pollinated by this moth. Just assume. So if you lose the moth, and let's assume that sexual reproduction is pretty important for plants. Sometimes it's not demographically the only way plants can reproduce, but let's assume that this is the case. What happens with the plant? You die out, isn't it? Like go extinct. Okay. So let's move to another mutualistic interaction. This is one of my kids' favorite birds. This is a toucanet feeding on the fruits of palmito palm in the Atlantic forest. Okay? And the fruits of palmito are eaten by almost everybody that is a vertebrate and it is not a strictly carnivorous animal in an Atlantic forest. So if the toucanet goes extinct, what happens with the palm? I don't know. Maybe you should analyze all these interactions, all mutualistic interactions of the same type in a given site to get some intuition about what will happen, isn't it? This is a good idea. So here is actually a network describing plants and frugivorous interactions. So each interaction here, a bird or a mammal take a fruit of a plant, get some food, and disperse the seeds away. So the plants are the green, because I'm not a creative person, and the reds are the animals, okay? And then you clearly see a mess, isn't it? You cannot see anything here. Just like some bunch of lines and points. But actually you can describe quantitatively the structure of these networks and analyze with dynamical models the consequences of this structure to perturbations. We saw a bit of that last talk when I talked yesterday when I talked about the connectance in food webs. It's exactly one of these aspects that you can measure in these structures. And actually nowadays you can make empirical experiments with some networks to test these predictions, which is pretty cool. So we can analyze that, and then something very surrealistic happens when people start to analyze mutualistic networks. So imagine that you are sampling mutualistic interactions of different types in different regions of the world. They have nothing in common but the fact that the organisms that interact with each other gain fitness benefit, okay? And sometimes, most of the time, this fitness benefit is not tested actually. You are just, there is some indicative. I mean, you have some evidence, but it's circumstantial. So we have these networks there. So because involve different groups, insects, mammals, fish, I would expect that in any place of the world, these structures will be different, depending on particular aspects of diversity in each site. But this is not true. This is not true. Actually, it's quite the opposite of what is true. The truth is that these networks share some organizing principles. Mutualistic interactions share a similar structure. Many mutualistic interactions share similar structures. And this structure is what we call nestedness. In a nested network, here I'm just organizing the network in such a way that here I have plants and animals, okay? And the lines are the interactions. And I organize in such a way that the top species over there has more links. It's the generalist species. And these species on the bottom are the specialist ones. And then it looks like, you know, like a curtain, isn't it? Like something like that. That you have a core of generalist species that interact with each other. You have asymmetries. A specialist is specialized in interact with a generalist. And you have very few of those interactions like the Darwin, orchid, and the moth. Specialist interactions. Those are very rare. Those are very cool, bizarre, idiosyncratic facts of nature, but they are not the general norm. The norm is this kind of structure. You almost have no specialist interaction in these systems. And these have many consequences for ecology and evolution, but I will focus here on the consequences to maintain diversity in terms of co-extinction cascades. And this is the work by Jan Mammoth. What Jen did was to use some tools that was first developed to study the robustness of internet to hacker attacks. He applied the same tools for mutualistic interactions, to pollination networks between, describe interactions between plants and pollinators. And so here you remove one species, and usually nothing happens. If you randomly remove species in these networks, diversity is pretty robust to that. It's like the internet. If my computer went down, nobody cares, isn't it? But then, if the generalist species die out, one example, one real example, in the Atlantic forest, if you have palmito, that I mentioned just before, is harvested by humans, we consume the palm heart. If you remove the palm heart, the palm dies. This particular palm dies. So if you remove the palmito, it's like a hacker attack on a Google server of the forest. And then the network goes down. We have much more extinctions occurring. So this suggests that not all species are equivalent in terms of relevance, but some species that are the highly connected species of those networks are the ones that are playing the key role in maintaining diversity in this system. And this is similar to what I mentioned before in the lecture on antagonisms, in which I argue that keystone species, usually high connected species, are the keystone elements of this community, because if you remove them, everything changes. Now I would like to move from this impact, this local impact of diversity, on diversity by mutualisms, to my claim that mutualisms define diversity. So let's start with a simple fact. Every cell of every animal, plant, or fungi in this world is a mutualistic interaction. There is no such a thing as an animal, plant, or fungi without mutualistic interactions. So the very big components, the main components that we call diversity, I know that bacteria is much more diverse, but what we call diversity, what we observe, are a product of mutualistic interactions. But you guys could argue that I'm overstating, because this is something that occurred millions of years in the past. And once you have plants and animals, well, they will have plants and animals. They do what they do, they diversify. So mutualism might be important to generate these forms, but not to generate and maintain diversity currently. Although Margulis argue that these symbiotic interactions are a mechanism to generate speciation, the evidence is that, okay, you can have speciation through these mechanisms, but it's not a particularly strong force leading to the emergence of a novel species. Okay, there is other mechanisms, many other mechanisms. But okay, so I would argue that lichen is essential to start the ecological succession process, and so without lichens, maybe if you destroy a forest, a temperate forest, you cannot recover the forest. Okay, but ecological succession is not only generated by the presence of this particular element. We have ecological succession going on here, and apparently lichens are not necessarily involved on that. So let's go to the most diverse system in terrestrial ecosystems, the tropical forests. In tropical forests, up to 90% of the trees, 9 of every 10 plant species rely on pollination by animals to do their reproduction. Well, 9 and 10, I would say that there is no forest without pollination by animals. It will be a different thing, but it will not be our forests. Likewise, in some ecological systems, in some tropical forests, up to 95% of the plants rely upon vertebrates for the dispersal of their seeds. Without these vertebrates, those plants will face demographic collapse. So without pollination and seed dispersal by animals, there is no such thing as the high diverse tropical forests. May have a forest, but it will not be this huge and diversifying forest in terms of plants that we have today. But plants are amazing. Plants don't only use animals, they use everything to make their living. They create some alliances that are bonds that with other organisms. We always call these plants that are nitrogen fixing, but this is wrong, isn't it? What is actually fixing nitrogen is not only the bacteria as well. It's the fact that you have microorganisms aggregated in particular structures in the roots of those plants that make the soil change qualitatively. And then nitrogen become available for life because nitrogen is a terrible dad joke that God put on us, because nitrogen is one of the most common elements on Earth, but life cannot use it, not in their pure form. And so thanks to those organisms in alliance, in bounded with plants, that we have nitrogen available in the rates that we have, they are available in most of the ecosystems on Earth. And many plants depend on that to get nitrogen. And they have the side effect of changing the soil of the entire ecosystem. And as I said, plants are amazing, and the work of this research is just, oh my God, this is incredible. Suzanne Simard is studying the fungi network, the mycorrhizae, that connect plants in forests, in temperate forests, but also probably in other forests as well. So those are fungi that link different plants, individual plants, for the same species and from the other species in the forest. A forest is not a bunch of trees, it's actually a network of fungi connecting different plants, and the plants send resources to each other through the fungi network. And they probably are sending also information about natural enemies through this network. It's like we are living, there is a World Wide Web in a forest that we have no idea that was operating there because we have no senses to detect it. But there is no forest, no temperate forest, at least without this network. Yeah?
So it wasn't clear to me. What is it regulating this network?
Oh my God. This network?
Yes.
We don't know. I mean, she's doing a lot of very cool experiments, and she actually can say that in some cases the plants is using the network. I don't know why, how. They use the network to send resources, and they usually send resources to co-specifics, to seedlings, with higher rate, like to the babies, than to other individuals of the same species, and with the other individuals of other species. They are sent to the individuals of other species and other individuals of the same species, but not as the rate they are sending to the seedlings. And this shift, this flow of resources change through the year. Sometimes in one direction, sometimes in another direction, and we have no clue.
And is there like evidence that when this gets compromised, the forest will collapse or something like that?
I think it's a good prediction.
Mm-hmm.
Because this, at least we know that there is some dumping effect that this network is generating. that allowing a plant to get resources for their neighborhoods. It's like a mutualistic interaction among plants using the fungi, isn't it? So today I'm healthy, you are not so well, so I'm giving you some resources. And now I'm bad, and then you pay back, and you have this game, and I will not be surprised that evolutionarily you have mechanisms that try to forbid cheating in this kind of interaction, the same way that we have on other mutualistic interactions. So, but these are all terrestrial ecosystems. It's just a part of the game. Okay, one more question.
Okay, just curious, like how does she measure like those stuff?
Oh, I can send you the papers. Like she actually made experiments, and there is some cool ways of measuring the rate of things flowing to the fungi. They can actually measure that.
Is it a machine or?
No. I don't know her work particularly, but there is another researcher that what she do is to use isotopes, and so she can actually. I don't know if Suzanne uses the same, isn't it? Like so, you just can see the flow because you keep the mycorrhizae in lab, and then you see the flow coming from one side to the other, and then you can measure how much flows, and you can do that experimentally on the field as well. It's so cool, isn't it? But this is not just terrestrial ecosystems. Terrestrial ecosystems are relevant. Most of the world are just ocean, but ocean is pretty much a desert. Ocean is pretty much a desert. If you sample randomly one bag of water, salt water in the ocean, there will be very, very low diversity there, especially out of the coastal shields. But then there is one exception. There is one exception where diversity is higher than in any other place on Earth. This is the most diverse ecosystem on Earth, coral reefs. But coral reefs are diverse because they have a lot of energy available. And they have a lot of energy available because of the interaction among coral and zooxanthella. 90% of the energy that flow through this ecosystem comes to this particular mutualistic interaction. There is no such a thing as a species-rich coral reef without this interaction. Okay. But mutualistic interactions are not only shaping diversity and generating diversity and maintaining diversity, they are also eroding diversity and creating a new world. We usually think in the way humans change the ecosystem as the effect of a single species, but this is wrong. We are not doing that alone. We actually create a company, a conglomerate, a guild of organisms. We are probably the central one because we establish the interactions with the several organisms, but our success, what makes us different in terms of ecological interactions of any other kind of mammal in the world, is that we establish a lot of mutualistic interactions. So with plants, we create a set of interactions that allow us to feed basically on plant resources. So we are carnivores, like Homo neanderthalis was essentially a carnivore, a hyperpredator, but they never had high numbers because it's a carnivore. But Homo sapiens is not a carnivore. I mean, we can eat meat, and we do a lot, but we rely upon plant resources. And once we domesticate plant resources, then we are producing our own food. And then we can grow a lot. But the plants are also domesticating us. They are shifting our physiology. And the same is true with the cattle. We always think, we are domesticating the cattle. That's true. This was the ancestral species of this kind of organism was a very violent organism. It was famous by the way he was a violent animal, a dangerous animal. And now, even a kid can be close to them, isn't it? But if you look at your genes, if you are from a lineage of humans that is associated to cattle, historically, you have a higher probability to have genes that allow you to use milk when you get old. And the distribution of the alleles that allow you to use milk as an adult in the population maps the distribution of the cattle and the domestication of cattle. So the cattle domesticated us as well. They shift our genes, our biology, our survival, they shape our populations. And together with dogs, we create the perfect killing machine, isn't it? Like, humans are one of the only animals that can kill at distance. We are very good on that. We don't need to go to physical contact to kill something. We have spears, we have bows, and things like that, isn't it? But dogs are really good in chase. They smell things that we never will be able to smell. They hear things that for us are just ghosts. And together we take over the resources. We are able to prey upon a lot of resources. This was very important to our rise as a dominant species in the world. But we are not a dominant species. But through this, not in an ecological sense. And through these interactions, we shape the world in ways that they will never become again what they were. We create a new, we, animals and plants with humans, create a new era, the Anthropocene. We have a geological era that is a result of how this group of species reshape diversity from 20 to 40% of the energy that comes from the sun and becomes biological energy, chemical energy available for life today are under the control of this small group of organisms. They shift completely what we call diversity. And this is a mutualistic interaction. And again, it could be odd. Okay, we kill the cattle, isn't it? We are killing the cattle. How the hell this can be? Oh, sorry, I should not say it like that. How the heck this should be a mutualism? Again, mutualisms are defined by the fitness effect. And never an ungulate in this world has the numbers that the cattle has. And actually, if you use biomass as a measure of dominance in a purely ecological sense, okay? Ecology is about numbers. So in ecological sense, the dominant species is the species that is more prevalent in the community, more common in the community. So here we are using the same concept to the entire planet, focus on mammals. The dominant mammal in the world is cattle, in biomass. There is more humans than cattle. But if you multiply by the individual weight, you end up with 2 kilos, about 2 kilos of cattle for each kilo of humans. Humans are apes that the cattle use to guarantee their reproduction and protection against the natural enemies that we killed to protect them. At the end of the day, we kill them and feed on their meat, but they produce a lot of offspring. This is in biomass, but do you know which is the terrestrial vertebrate that has the higher numbers? Is it more difficult to estimate because we never know how many rats there are in the world. But apparently there are not so many as people used to think. But for sure the dominant bird in the world are chickens. We have 3 chickens for each person in the world. Okay? Even the passenger pigeon. Please Google passenger pigeon if you don't know what it was. It was a species that we killed that was the dominant bird species in the world before. They have a flock of 3 billion birds. It's a flock that was a huge flock that could create an eclipse. It's amazing. The descriptions are amazing. It's amazing. Search for passenger pigeon, you see, it's amazing. But even the passenger pigeon is not comparable with chickens. So we are apes that the chicken domesticates to protect the chicken against their natural enemies. Again, we are under control. So this creates some sense that, we think that we are in control, eh? I don't know how much control we have if rice and yeast die out. I'm not sure if we'll be in good shape if rice and yeast die out, okay? But we can only, from a purely ecological point of view, what we are seeing is a mutualism shaping diversity. So I would finish arguing that, well, mutualisms create animals, plants, and fungi. They maintain the species-rich ecological communities in the ocean and on land. And now they are the underlying process shaping diversity in a different direction, creating the Anthropocene. But as I said, I am just a man in love by mutualistic interaction, so I am overemphasizing. Please forgive me for that. To finish, we talk about positive interactions, effects on a stronger competitor. If the stronger competitor establish mutualistic interactions, this will decay diversity. Positive interactions may increase diversity by changing abiotic conditions, reducing competition, reducing antagonisms in some situation, and by generating networks that provide support against random extinctions in ecosystems. Also, positive interactions are on the root on what we call the diversity, the biodiversity. As to know more about that, I would like to suggest 2 readings related to Judy Brownstein. One is a book that she put together on mutualistic interactions. There is chapters from different people focusing on different types of mutualisms and consequences of mutualisms to ecology and evolution. And recently, he wrote together with Caitlin Matisse annual review on commensalistic interactions. Is a very interesting work. So those are, in my opinion, 2 good readings to start to know more about mutualistic interactions. So with that, I finish my set of lectures. As I said, it was a very biased version of community ecology towards ecological interactions, but I hope that this could give you guys a glimpse about the processes structuring diversity, at least how ecological interactions can structure diversity locally. It was a pleasure, and if you guys need any additional information, or if I can help with in any ways with your progress in your career, please feel free to email me anytime you want. Okay? Thank you so much. I will stay around here more to 15, 20 minutes, so if you guys have any question, please. Oh yeah. Tomorrow we have 2 talks by 2 postdocs in my lab, Erika Santana and Caroline Draxler, and they will talk about ecological interactions. Erika will talk more about social networks and how they relate to ecological networks, and Carol will talk about how mutualistic and antagonistic interactions combine to each other in ecological communities.